The coins scattered across the checkout counter, with a sound that made everyone in the store turn and look. $13.47. That was everything Maria Santos had in the world, and it wasn't enough to buy the diapers her 8-month-old son desperately needed. She stood there in her cleaning uniform, still wearing her apron from her shift, holding her baby against her hip while the cashier stared at her with impatient eyes. The total on the screen was $14.29, and Maria was 82 cents short. She could feel the stares of the people in line behind her, could feel their judgment and irritation burning into her back. She was about to grab her coins and walk away in shame when a hand reached past her and placed a $100 bill on the counter. She turned to see who had done it and felt her blood freeze. The man behind her was tall, muscular, covered in tattoos that crawled up his neck and down his arms. His eyes were cold and hard, the eyes of someone who had seen terrible things and done worse. His name was Viktor Volkov, and he was the most feared crime boss in Philadelphia. He looked at Maria's baby, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted. He told the cashier to ring up everything the woman needed. Not just the diapers, everything. What happened next would change Maria's life in ways she never could have imagined. If you're ready for this story, type in the comments where you're watching from. Maria Santos was 28 years old, and she had been surviving on nothing for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have enough. She worked as a cleaning lady for a company that serviced office buildings in downtown Philadelphia, scrubbing floors and toilets and windows for $8 an hour. No benefits, no job security, no future. She had been doing this work for 6 years, ever since she dropped out of community college when her mother got sick and someone had to pay the medical bills. Her days started at 4 in the morning, when she would wake up in the dark, get dressed in her blue uniform and white apron, and catch the first bus to Center City. She cleaned 3 buildings before noon, moving through empty offices that belonged to lawyers and accountants and executives who earned more in a week than she earned in a year. She emptied their trash cans and scrubbed their coffee stains and cleaned their bathrooms, and none of them ever looked at her when they passed her in the hallways. Her mother had died 3 years ago, leaving Maria with nothing but debt and memories. Her father had left when she was 12, disappeared one day and never came back, and Maria had learned early that the only person she could depend on was herself. She had built her life around that lesson, had hardened herself against disappointment, had stopped expecting anything from anyone. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then she had met Daniel. Daniel was a construction worker she had met at a bus stop one rainy evening. He had been kind and funny, had made her laugh for the first time in years, had looked at her like she was worth something. They had fallen in love quickly, desperately, the way people do when they've been lonely for too long. Within 6 months they were living together in a tiny apartment in South Philadelphia, and within a year Maria was pregnant. She had been terrified when she found out. They couldn't afford a baby, could barely afford themselves. But Daniel had been excited, had promised to work harder, to take extra shifts, to build a life for their child. He had painted the nursery himself, had assembled the crib with his own hands, had talked about the future like it was something to look forward to rather than fear. He had bought a stuffed elephant for the baby, the first toy Lucas would ever own, and Maria still kept it in the crib where Lucas slept. Then the accident happened. Daniel was working on a high-rise construction project in downtown Philadelphia, 30 stories up, when a cable snapped and a load of steel beams came crashing down. He was killed instantly along with 2 other workers. The company sent a representative to Maria's apartment with condolences and a check for $10,000, which barely covered the funeral expenses and the hospital bills, from when Maria gave birth alone without insurance 2 months later. She had labored for 16 hours, crying for Daniel between contractions, and when Lucas finally arrived, she had held him and promised that she would never let him suffer for her mistakes. Now Maria was raising her son Lucas by herself, working 12-hour shifts, leaving him with an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Rodriguez, who watched him for almost nothing because she remembered what it was like to be young and desperate. Mrs. Rodriguez was 73 years old, a widow from Puerto Rico who had raised 6 children of her own and had a heart big enough to take in one more. Maria earned about $1,500 a month, and after rent, utilities, and the minimum payments on her mother's medical debt, she had almost nothing left for food and diapers, and all the things a baby needed. That Tuesday had been the worst day yet. Her shift had ended at 8 in the evening, and she had picked up Lucas from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment to find that he had used the last diaper hours ago and had been sitting in a wet cloth ever since. Mrs. Rodriguez had apologized profusely, had offered to give Maria money for diapers, but Maria had refused because accepting charity felt like admitting defeat. She had her pride, even when she had nothing else. She had exactly $13.47 in her purse. She knew because she had counted it that morning, had calculated how long it would have to last until her next paycheck on Friday. 3 days. She had to make $13 last 3 days, and her son needed diapers now. She had already skipped lunch to save money, had already decided she would skip dinner too, had already accepted that her own needs came last after Lucas's. Maria had walked to the store with Lucas on her hip, had grabbed the smallest, cheapest package of diapers she could find, and had gone to the checkout line praying that it would be enough. She counted her coins twice as she waited, hoping she had miscounted, hoping for a miracle. It wasn't enough. Viktor Volkov was 42 years old, and he had built his empire on the principle that nothing happened in his territory without his knowledge. He ran the Volkov organization, a criminal enterprise that had started with his grandfather in the back rooms of Brighton Beach and had expanded under Viktor's leadership into a multi-million-dollar operation spanning the entire eastern seaboard. Viktor was not in the grocery store that Tuesday evening because he shopped for his own food. He had people who did that for him, along with everything else that ordinary people did for themselves. He was there because the store was owned by one of his associates, and there had been reports of employees skimming from the registers. Viktor had decided to see for himself, to observe without being noticed, to understand what was happening before he decided how to handle it. He was standing in line at the checkout, studying the cashier's hands and the movement of money, when the woman in front of him emptied her purse onto the counter. The coins fell like a confession, spreading across the surface in a display of poverty that made Viktor's chest tighten unexpectedly. He watched as the woman counted them with trembling fingers, watched as her face fell when she realized she didn't have enough, watched as she held her baby closer, like she was protecting him from the shame she was feeling. Viktor had seen poverty before. He had grown up in it, had watched his mother work 3 jobs to keep them fed, had gone to bed hungry more times than he could count. His father had been killed in a territorial dispute when Viktor was 14, and his mother had never recovered from the loss. She had worked herself to death by the time Viktor was 20, leaving him alone in a world that had never shown him kindness. He had promised himself then that he would never be poor again, that he would never be powerless, that he would build something so strong that no one could ever take anything from him. He had kept that promise, had accumulated wealth and power beyond anything his parents could have imagined, but he had also lost something along the way, some essential piece of his humanity that he had traded for survival. He had become cold, calculating, a man who saw people as assets or obstacles rather than human beings. Looking at this woman with her coins and her baby and her cleaning uniform, Viktor felt something he hadn't felt in years: recognition. He saw his mother in her tired eyes, saw his childhood in her desperate counting, saw everything he had escaped from and everything he had become. The baby on her hip had blue eyes that reminded him of photographs he had seen of himself as an infant, taken in a cramped apartment in Brighton Beach before his father was killed, and everything changed. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store hummed overhead. The cashier sighed impatiently, fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for the woman to admit defeat and put back the diapers she couldn't afford. Other customers in line shifted their weight, their annoyance palpable. No one offered to help. No one seemed to see her as anything other than an inconvenience. Viktor reached into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and placed it on the counter before he could think about what he was doing. The woman turned to look at him, and Viktor saw the fear flash across her face as she took in his appearance. He was used to that fear, had cultivated it deliberately, had made it a tool of his trade. His tattoos were visible, crawling up his neck and covering his arms, each one marking a chapter of his violent history. His black shirt was expensive but understated, the uniform of a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But seeing the fear in this woman's eyes, this mother who was just trying to buy diapers for her child, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. He told the cashier to ring up everything the woman needed. Then he turned to Maria, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, he asked her if she needed a job. Maria stared at the man with the tattoos and the $100 bill, and the offer of employment, and every instinct she had told her to run. She had grown up in Philadelphia, had lived in neighborhoods where men like this were whispered about in fearful tones. She knew what the tattoos meant, knew what the cold eyes meant, knew that accepting anything from a man like this came with strings attached. But she also knew that her son needed diapers tonight and food tomorrow and medicine when he got sick. She knew that her landlord was threatening eviction if she didn't catch up on rent by the end of the month. She knew that she was drowning, had been drowning for months, and no one had reached out a hand to help her until now. The man introduced himself as Viktor. He didn't give a last name, didn't explain what kind of job he was offering, didn't make any promises or threats. He simply handed her a business card with a phone number and an address, and told her that if she wanted work, she should come to that address tomorrow at noon. Maria took the card because she didn't know what else to do. She watched as he paid for her diapers, and then walked out of the store without looking back, leaving her standing at the checkout with a bag of baby supplies and a head full of questions. That night, Maria sat in her tiny apartment with Lucas sleeping in her arms, staring at the business card and trying to decide what to do. She searched the address on her phone and found that it was a restaurant in Center City, an upscale place called Volkov's that she had walked past many times but never imagined entering. She searched the name Viktor and found nothing useful, just social media profiles of people who clearly weren't the man she had met. She asked Mrs. Rodriguez what she knew about the restaurant, and the old woman's face went pale. She told Maria to stay away, that the place was owned by dangerous people, that nothing good came from accepting favors from men like that. But when Maria pressed her for specifics, Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't provide any, just rumors and fears and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent avoiding trouble. Maria didn't sleep that night. She held Lucas and watched him breathe and thought about all the things she wanted to give him and all the things she couldn't afford. She thought about Daniel, who had promised her a future and then left her alone with nothing but memories. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself to death trying to provide for her family. She thought about all the people who had told her to work hard and be honest, and things would work out, and how none of that had ever been true. By morning, she had made her decision. She couldn't afford to say no. The restaurant was even more impressive in person than it had looked online. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and waiters in formal uniforms who moved with practiced precision. Maria felt out of place in her best dress, which was really just her least worn dress, holding Lucas against her hip because she had no one to leave him with on such short notice. She told the hostess that she was there to see Viktor, and the hostess's eyes widened slightly before she composed herself and led Maria to a private room in the back of the restaurant. Viktor was sitting at a table with papers spread before him, a cup of coffee in his hand, and reading glasses perched on his nose. The glasses surprised Maria. They made him look almost ordinary, almost like a businessman rather than whatever she had imagined him to be. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes went immediately to Lucas. Something softened in his face just for a moment, before the hardness returned. The baby was awake now, looking around the room with curious eyes, reaching toward the light that streamed through the windows. He asked her to sit down and offered her coffee, which she accepted because her hands needed something to hold. The coffee was excellent, the best she had ever tasted, served in a cup so delicate she was afraid she might break it. Then he explained what he was offering. The restaurant needed a cleaning supervisor, someone to manage the night crew, make sure everything was spotless before opening, handle the schedules and the supplies and the inevitable problems that came with keeping a high-end establishment immaculate. The previous supervisor had left suddenly, and Viktor needed someone reliable, someone who understood what it meant to work hard, someone who wouldn't cut corners or steal from him. He needed someone he could trust. He offered her a salary that was more than twice what she was making at the cleaning company. $50,000 a year, which sounded like a fortune to someone who had been counting coins for diapers. He offered health insurance for her and Lucas, the kind of comprehensive coverage that Maria had never had in her life. He offered paid vacation, something that didn't exist in her current world, and a schedule that would let her spend mornings with her son before dropping him at Mrs. Rodriguez's. He offered everything she had been struggling to achieve, wrapped up in a neat package and handed to her by a man she had every reason to fear. Maria asked him why. Why her? Why this? Why would he help a stranger he had met for 30 seconds at a grocery store checkout? Viktor was quiet for a long moment.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Then he told her about his mother, about the cleaning jobs and the hunger and the sacrifices, about watching her die with nothing to show for a lifetime of labor, about the promise he had made to himself and the ways he had kept that promise, and the things he had done that he couldn't take back. He said that he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had brought him to where he was, but he could do this one thing. He could give one mother a chance to survive, a chance to raise her son without working herself into an early grave. He said it wasn't redemption, wasn't charity, wasn't even kindness. It was just something he needed to do for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Maria listened, and despite everything she knew and feared, she believed him. There was something in his voice, something raw and honest, that cut through all the danger and mystery surrounding him. She said yes. The first few months were harder than Maria had expected. She had to learn a new job, manage employees who were suspicious of the new supervisor who had appeared out of nowhere, and navigate a world that operated by rules she didn't fully understand. There were whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, visitors who came to the restaurant after hours, and met with Viktor in his private office. Things that happened in the shadows that she trained herself not to notice. The restaurant itself was a revelation. Maria had cleaned many buildings in her career, but she had never been responsible for maintaining something so beautiful. The crystal chandeliers had to be cleaned by hand, every piece polished until it sparkled. The marble floors required special care, specific products, a technique that took her weeks to master. The kitchen was a world unto itself, with standards of cleanliness that exceeded anything she had encountered in hospitals or medical clinics. But she learned. She observed and adapted and asked questions when she needed to. And gradually she earned the respect of the people who worked under her. They stopped seeing her as Viktor's pet project and started seeing her as a colleague, a leader, someone who understood their struggles because she had lived them herself. But she also found unexpected kindness. The other cleaning staff, once they realized she wasn't there to spy on them or make their lives difficult, welcomed her into their community. They shared stories about their own struggles, helped her find a better daycare for Lucas, invited her to birthday parties and quinceañeras and Sunday dinners. There was Rosa, a grandmother from Guatemala, who made the best tamales Maria had ever tasted. There was Miguel, a young man putting himself through community college, who reminded Maria of the dreams she had once had for herself. There was Svetlana, a Russian immigrant who had worked for Viktor's family for 20 years and knew more about the business than she ever revealed. Viktor kept his distance at first, checking in occasionally to make sure she had what she needed, but never crossing the professional boundary he had established. Maria was grateful for that. She didn't want to owe him more than she already did, didn't want to become entangled in whatever dark business funded the restaurant and its owner. She did her job, took care of her son, and tried not to think about the contradictions of her situation. But over time, the distance began to shrink. Viktor started stopping by the restaurant in the evenings when Maria was supervising the cleaning crew and Lucas was sleeping in a portable crib in her office. He would bring her coffee, ask about her day, play with Lucas when the baby was awake and fussy. He was surprisingly good with children, patient and gentle, in a way that seemed at odds with everything else about him. Lucas would reach for him, would laugh when Viktor made faces, would fall asleep in his arms like he was the safest place in the world. Maria watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She didn't understand why Viktor cared, why he kept coming back, why he seemed to find such peace in the presence of a baby he had no obligation to love. She asked him once, late at night when the cleaning was done, and they were sitting in her office drinking coffee, and Viktor was quiet for a long moment before answering. He told her that he had never had children of his own, that the life he had chosen didn't allow for that kind of vulnerability, that he had always known that bringing a child into his world would be cruel and irresponsible. But watching Lucas grow, watching Maria fight for her son with a fierceness that reminded him of his own mother, had awakened something in him that he had thought was dead, a longing for the life he had never lived, a glimpse of the person he might have been if circumstances had been different. 6 months after she started, Maria arrived at work to find Viktor waiting for her with a serious expression. Her heart sank, convinced that he was about to fire her, that the dream was ending and she would be back where she started, counting coins at a checkout counter. But Viktor didn't fire her. He offered her something else entirely. He told her that he owned several properties around the city, apartment buildings that housed many of his employees and their families. One of those buildings had a vacant unit, a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood called Rittenhouse, with good light and tree-lined streets and a playground visible from the living room window. He offered it to her at a fraction of the market rent, with the first 3 months free while she built up her savings. Maria wanted to say no. She had promised herself that she would take only what she earned, that she would not become dependent on Viktor's generosity, that she would maintain her independence even as she accepted his help. But she thought about Lucas, about the cramped apartment they lived in now in South Philadelphia, about the noise and the crime and the bars on the windows and the lack of space for a growing child to play. She said yes again. The apartment was everything Viktor had promised and more. 2 bedrooms, one for her and one for Lucas, with enough space for a small play area and a kitchen where she could actually cook proper meals instead of microwaving things from cans. The building was well maintained, the neighbors were friendly, and there was a daycare center just 2 blocks away that had openings and accepted the insurance that Maria now had thanks to her job. The daycare had a garden where the children could play, and teachers who read to them and taught them songs, and Lucas thrived there in ways he never had with Mrs. Rodriguez, as much as Maria loved the old woman. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she could breathe, like the weight that had been pressing on her chest since Daniel died had finally begun to lift. Like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. 1 year after that evening at the grocery store, Maria sat in Viktor's office after the restaurant had closed for the night. Lucas was 2 years old now, walking and talking and getting into everything, currently asleep in his mother's lap, after exhausting himself playing with the blocks Viktor kept in his office specifically for that purpose. Viktor was pouring 2 glasses of wine, a ritual they had developed over the months of late-night conversations and gradually lowered walls. Maria had learned more about him than she had ever expected to know, about the empire he had built and the blood that stained it, about the enemies he had destroyed and the people he had protected, about the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. She had also told him things she had never told anyone else, about her father who had abandoned her and her mother who had died in her arms, about Daniel, the first person she had ever trusted and the last person she had expected to lose, about the despair she had felt that night at the grocery store when she had been 82 cents short of diapers and had considered walking into traffic on the way home. Viktor listened to that confession with an expression she couldn't read. Then he told her that he was glad she hadn't. That meeting her had changed something in him, had reminded him of parts of himself he had thought were dead. He said that he had spent his whole life building walls and accumulating power, convinced that strength meant never needing anyone. But watching Maria rebuild her life, watching her fight for her son, watching her maintain her dignity and her kindness despite everything she had endured, had shown him a different kind of strength. He said that he loved her, not romantically, though something deeper than friendship had grown between them. He loved her the way he might have loved a sister, the way he might have loved the family he had never had. He said that she and Lucas were the closest thing to family he had experienced since his mother died, and that protecting them, providing for them, watching them thrive, had given his life a meaning it had never had before. Maria didn't know what to say. She had spent so long guarding herself against disappointment that she had forgotten how to accept love when it was offered. But sitting in Viktor's office with her son sleeping in her arms and a glass of wine in her hand, she felt something she had thought was lost forever: hope. She told Viktor that she loved him too, that he had saved her life that night at the grocery store, not just with the $100 bill, but with the offer of a future she had stopped believing in. She said that she didn't care about his past, didn't judge him for the choices he had made to survive, because she understood survival in a way that people who had never been desperate could never understand. She had been desperate herself, had stood at that checkout counter with her last coins and her crying baby, and she knew what it meant to do whatever you had to do to keep going. Viktor reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a long moment. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds. Two souls who had recognized something kindred in each other across a grocery store checkout line. The city moved outside the window. Millions of people living their lives, unaware that in this small office above a restaurant, something rare and beautiful was being born. 2 years after that conversation, Viktor and Maria were married. It was a small ceremony, held in the garden of a house in Chestnut Hill that Viktor had purchased for them, with only close friends and the staff who had become family in attendance. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, crying happy tears and telling everyone who would listen that she had known from the beginning that Maria was destined for something special. Svetlana was there, skeptical as always, but unable to hide her smile when Viktor said his vows. Rosa and Miguel were there, along with the other cleaning staff who had watched Maria transform from a desperate stranger into a confident leader. Lucas, now 3 years old, served as the ring-bearer, though he was more interested in the butterflies in the garden than in his official duties. Viktor lifted him up when the ceremony was done, held both Maria and Lucas in his arms, and Maria saw tears in his eyes for the first time. 3 years later, Viktor made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He began the process of legitimizing his businesses, transitioning away from the criminal operations that had built his empire and into legal investments that could sustain it. The process was dangerous and complicated, involving negotiations with rivals and law enforcement, and former associates who felt betrayed. There were moments when Viktor thought it might cost him everything, including his life. There were nights when he stayed awake with a gun on the nightstand, listening for sounds that didn't belong. There were weeks when he sent Maria and Lucas to stay with relatives she didn't know she had, in places she couldn't identify, for safety. But he had a reason now. He had Maria and Lucas, the family he had never expected to have, the people who had shown him that there was more to life than power and fear. He wanted to give them something clean, something they could be proud of, something that wouldn't put them in danger or taint them with his past. He wanted Lucas to grow up without shame, without fear, without the knowledge that his father had built his fortune on other people's suffering. By the time Lucas started school at a prestigious private academy in the suburbs, Viktor's transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer the most feared crime boss in Philadelphia. He was a businessman, a restaurateur, a philanthropist who funded programs for single mothers and their children through a foundation named for his mother. He still had enemies, still had to watch his back, still carried the scars of a life lived in the shadows. But he also had something he had never expected: a family. The foundation grew into something neither Viktor nor Maria had anticipated. It started as a small program, offering emergency assistance to mothers who found themselves in the same desperate circumstances Maria had faced that night at the grocery store. But it expanded quickly, fueled by Viktor's resources and Maria's understanding of what women in crisis actually needed. They funded daycare programs and job training, housing assistance and legal aid, all the things that Maria had needed and hadn't had access to. Maria became the face of the foundation, telling her story at fundraisers and conferences, showing people what was possible when someone reached out a hand at the right moment. She finished her college degree at 35, something she had never thought possible, and began working toward a master's in social work. She wanted to help other women the way she had been helped, wanted to make sure that no mother ever had to count coins at a checkout counter and wonder how she would feed her child. Maria watched Lucas run toward Viktor one afternoon in Fairmount Park, watched her son launch himself into the arms of the man who had become his father in every way that mattered, and felt tears streaming down her face. Lucas was 7 now, smart and curious and kind. The best parts of Daniel and Viktor and herself combined into one beautiful boy. She thought about that night at the grocery store, about the coins on the counter, and the shame she had felt and the stranger who had stepped forward when no one else would. She thought about all the paths her life could have taken, all the ways that night could have ended, all the futures that had closed when Daniel died, and all the futures that had opened when Viktor placed a $100 bill on a checkout counter. She had been 82 cents short of diapers, and a Mafia boss had given her the world. Viktor walked over to her with Lucas on his shoulders, the boy laughing and grabbing at leaves from the trees above. The autumn sun was setting over the Philadelphia skyline, painting the city in gold and orange, and Maria thought she had never seen anything so beautiful. Viktor asked her what she was thinking about, and Maria smiled. She told him she was thinking about coins, about how such small things could determine the course of a life, about how she had counted out $13.47 on a checkout counter, and it had turned out to be the luckiest moment of her life. Viktor smiled back, that rare, genuine smile that she had learned to treasure, and told her that it had been the luckiest moment of his life, too, because he had found what he had spent 40 years searching for. He had found home, and it had cost him exactly $100, and the choice to see a struggling mother as a person rather than a stranger. Some investments, he told Maria as they walked home together through the falling leaves, pay dividends you never expected. She laughed and leaned into him, Lucas chattering happily above them about the squirrels he had seen and the games he wanted to play, and knew that he was right. Some investments changed everything. If this story made you believe that sometimes the smallest moment can lead to the greatest transformation, leave a little heart below to let me know. And if you chose to stay until the end, it means stories like this touch something true in you too. For those who wish to support these stories, there's an option to leave a heartfelt thanks through the feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Viktor's gesture at the checkout counter counted more than anyone could have predicted, because you chose to stay until the very last word, and that makes you part of this story.